You wake up in a palace carved from eternity. The air is still, as if even time is holding its breath. Beyond the pillars, the desert sun pours down like molten gold, but inside these stone walls, there is only silence. Heavy silence. Sacred silence. Your name is not yet written in the book of the dead, but one day it will be, because you were born into a secret so holy, so horrifying that it will shape the entire kingdom. You are a child of Pharaoh. But not just any Pharaoh. You are part of a bloodline so obsessed with power, so terrified of losing its divine claim, that they are willing to break the most primal taboo known to mankind. They marry their sisters. Not for love, not for lust, but for control. This is not just a story about ancient Egypt. This is a story about what happens when the pursuit of power poisons every human bond, when family becomes strategy, when blood becomes currency, and when divinity is used as a weapon. This is the story of pharaohs who turned incest into policy. Long before the pyramids became tourist attractions, long before the desert sands swallowed forgotten tombs, Egypt had already mastered the art of eternal control. The pharaoh wasn't just a king. He was a god, Horus in the flesh, the living bridge between heaven and earth. And gods, of course, cannot mix their blood with mortals. So pharaohs did something else. They created a system where power never had to leave the royal family, because the royal family would fold in on itself. Father married daughter, brother married sister, again and again, generation after generation. This wasn't just accepted. It was celebrated, inscribed in temple walls, painted in tombs, justified by myth, because to the people, the pharaoh was divine, and divine blood must remain pure. But underneath this ideology was fear, paranoia, the unrelenting terror that if royal blood mingled with common blood, everything would collapse. The gods would turn their backs, crops would fail, enemies would invade, and the balance of Mayat, the sacred order, would shatter. And so, the throne was protected by incest. It didn't start with one pharaoh. It started with a belief that power must never dilute, that blood must never mix, and that family must become machinery. Take, for example, Pharaoh Akhenaten, the so-called heretic king. The man who would later shake Egypt's spiritual foundations didn't rise from chaos. He rose from design. Akhenaten was born into the 18th dynasty, one of the most powerful dynasties in Egyptian history. His father was Amenhotep III, his mother most likely Tiye. But when it came time to choose a queen, Akhenaten didn't look outside the palace walls. He married his sister. Her name was Nefertiti. Yes, that Nefertiti, the woman whose face is now immortalized in one of the most iconic statues in the world, regal, poised, flawless. But her beauty wasn't the only reason she was chosen. She was royal. She was blood. She was safe. To understand why this mattered, you have to understand how Egypt viewed kingship. To rule, a pharaoh didn't just need charisma or strength. He needed legitimacy. And legitimacy came from two places, birthright and the gods. If either were in question, the entire kingdom could turn to dust. By marrying his sister, Akhenaten wasn't breaking rules. He was fulfilling expectations. He was reinforcing the sacred circle, keeping power within a loop no outsider could penetrate. And yet, this wasn't just a political move. It was psychological. Because in a world where everyone worships you, the only people who understand your position are those just like you. Your blood, your mirror. When you are a god king, no one dares speak freely to you except your sister, who shares your blood, your burden, and your throne. They became a unit, not just politically, but mythologically. Together they ruled not just as man and woman, but as divine opposites. Male and female forces merged, like Osiris and Isis, like Geb and Nut. To the public, their marriage wasn't taboo. It was sacred theater. But behind the curtains, a different story was playing out. Akhenaten wasn't normal. He saw things differently. Where others saw temples, he saw lies. Where others saw dozens of gods, he saw only one, the sun. He worshipped Aten, the solar disk, and he dismantled centuries of religious tradition to do it. Temples to Amun were shut down. Priests were stripped of power. Gods were erased. This wasn't just theological reform. It was war, and Nefertiti was his partner in it. Together they built a new capital, Akhetaten, the horizon of Aten, a city devoted entirely to their new religion, and in the heart of it stood them, royal, radiant, untouchable. But this golden dream had a price. The priests, the people, even parts of the royal court, none of them were ready to let go of the old ways. And though Akhenaten held the throne, he was growing more isolated, more fanatical, more unstable. And Nefertiti, Some say she vanished. Others say she became Pharaoh herself. The records are mysterious, conflicting, because history doesn't record clearly what happens when gods turn inward. But one thing is certain. It all began with a marriage. A marriage between siblings. A marriage that wasn't about love, but about power. About isolation, preservation, control. This is just the beginning. Because Akhenaten wasn't the first pharaoh to marry his sister, and he wouldn't be the last. Some would go even further. And in the name of power, they would destroy their own bloodline from the inside. Stay with me. The real madness hasn't even begun. By now, you've heard the whispers. That pharaohs slept with their sisters. That the throne of Egypt was built on bloodlines too pure to touch, and too cursed to escape. But what if I told you this wasn't just an isolated ritual? What if it wasn't some mad exception? But the very structure holding Egypt together. Because once the gods had sanctioned it, once the people had accepted it, royal incest became more than tradition. It became law. It became doctrine. It became expected. And the deeper you go, the darker it gets. Let's go back, not to Akhenaten, but further, much further, back to the time of the Old Kingdom when pyramids still scraped the heavens and kings were closer to the sun than any man dared to believe. It is here in the dust and gold of ancient Memphis that the pattern begins. Look at the god Osiris. He didn't just marry anyone. He married Isis, his sister. And this wasn't a problem. This was the template. Osiris, ruler of the dead. Isis, queen of magic. Their sacred bond gave birth to Horus, the falcon god of kingship. This wasn't mythology to the Egyptians. It was political science disguised as religion. So if the gods married their sisters to maintain cosmic balance, why shouldn't the pharaohs? They were gods too, after all. From Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid, to Tutankhamun, the boy king whose very DNA betrayed the truth, the thread remains the same. They married their sisters, their daughters, sometimes even their mothers, not in secret, not in shame, but openly, lavishly, publicly, with golden crowns, sacred hymns, and divine justification carved in stone. But make no mistake, this was not about romance. This was not some ancient fairy tale twisted by time. This was power consolidation in its rawest form. In a kingdom of unimaginable wealth and eternal glory, the biggest threat was not the enemy outside the gates, but the rival within the bloodline. And so, the logic was brutal. If no one outside the family could touch the throne, then no one outside the family could take it. It was a closed circuit, a locked vault, a kingdom trapped in a genetic echo chamber. And like all closed systems, it began to rot from within. Let's talk about Tutankhamun, perhaps the most famous pharaoh of them all. For centuries his name was buried beneath the sand, until Howard Carter cracked open his tomb in 1922 and unleashed a global obsession. But beyond the gold mask, beyond the glittering relics, was a darker truth. Tutankhamun's body was broken. His spine was twisted, his foot deformed, his skull elongated, his hips disproportionately wide. For decades historians debated the cause. Then came DNA testing, and the results were devastating. Tutankhamun's parents, brother and sister. His wife, also his half-sister. The royal bloodline had become a genetic trap, folding in on itself for so many generations that deformities were inevitable. Beauty on the outside, but decay within. And yet they continued, because to open the bloodline would mean opening the throne. And that, for a divine king, was unthinkable. You have to imagine the palace, a sacred compound of obsession and anxiety. Princes who could not trust their cousins, queens who were also nieces, sons who were also husbands, a family tree that no longer branched. It circled. But there was another reason pharaohs married their sisters, not just for purity, not just for control, but for symbolism, because each time a brother married a sister, it reenacted the myth of Osiris and Isis. It reaffirmed Egypt's link to the divine. It told the people that balance had been restored, that the gods approved. In a society where symbolism was politics, this mattered more than anything. You weren't just marrying your sister. You were reenacting creation itself. But beneath the ritual, beneath the incense and chants, the consequences were mounting. The gene pool shrank. Birth defects increased. Dynasties collapsed. And still, they kept going. Because power doesn't care about consequences until it's too late. The royal family had become a serpent devouring its own tail. A dynasty too divine to adapt. Too holy to evolve. And in the end, that holiness became its downfall. He ruled with a stillness that terrified even the wind. Not a warrior, not a builder, not a reformer, but a shadow. a presence, a symbol carved from absolute control. His name was erased, and yet his monuments still stand. His face was chiseled off walls, yet his legacy lingers like smoke. We call him Schmenker in whispers, or maybe Neferneferueten. The records fight each other, rewriting themselves with every generation, because that's what he wanted. To be untraceable, untouchable, and above all, unchallenged. He was not just afraid of losing power. He was afraid of anyone else ever being remembered. The incest that once symbolized divine order had become a prison. Marrying his sister wasn't enough. Loving her wasn't required. She was a tool. A placeholder in a dynasty whose bloodline had become so self-referential that nothing outside the royal chambers could even be considered legitimate. He dissolved the lineage not by killing his rivals, but by pretending they never existed. Their names were scraped from stone, their faces removed from temples, their statues smashed to sand. Egypt became a country where history itself was an enemy. To control the story was to control the future, and the pharaoh held the chisel. Not even his own children were spared, especially not his children, because a son, even one born of a sacred sister wife, could still grow to question, could still dream of his own crown, could still remember that gods die too. So they were silenced, not with blades, but with omission. Their names were never spoken, their births never recorded, their tombs never built. This was the cost of eternal power, not just isolation, but annihilation of everything that could remind the world you were once human. When archaeologists began uncovering traces of this ruler, they found contradictions. Royal inscriptions half erased, cartouches that didn't match any other pharaoh, graves too grand for a servant, too unmarked for a king. What emerged was a portrait of obsession, not with conquest, not with glory, but with control over memory itself. To marry your sister was to anchor your godhood in myth. But to erase your lineage entirely, that was something darker. A pharaoh who wanted no sons, no successors, no faces in the future that might challenge his divine mask. He turned incest into obliteration, no longer a sacred duty, but a final wall between himself and vulnerability. It was as if he feared the idea of anyone remembering love. Because love implies weakness, love implies mortality, and gods cannot bleed. This ruler didn't leave behind gold or mystery. He left absence, the kind that echoes louder than any monument. What terrified him wasn't rebellion, it was recognition. That someone might look back and see the man behind the crown, the brother, the husband, the son, the frightened little boy clinging to incestuous power like a raft in a storm, and so he vanished everyone who could name him. The palace halls remained silent. The statues smiled without names. The throne room echoed with footsteps that never arrived. The empire endured, but the story frayed, and in the ruins the dust refused to settle. Even today, historians argue about whether this pharaoh truly existed, whether he was a man or a mask worn by others, whether the silence surrounding him was engineered or earned. But the tombs tell the truth. The scarred walls, the missing faces, the strange gaps in royal lineage, the child corpses buried hastily in anonymous graves, their genetic markers twisted, brittle, broken. They weren't accidents. They were policy. This wasn't about love. It was never about love. It was about lineage without humanity, reign without intimacy, power without legacy. And somewhere inside that cold marble silence, a sister queen sat beside a god king, knowing she would never be remembered for her face, her voice, or her rule, only for the bloodline she helped protect, even as it destroyed itself. Somewhere deep in the folds of ancient Alexandria, long after the sands had covered the old gods and Rome had crept into Egypt's veins, another dynasty rose from the ashes. They were not Egyptian by blood but by ambition, the Ptolemies, born from Alexander's conquest and raised to wear crowns they never truly inherited. And with them the tradition returned. Not out of piety, not out of myth, but out of raw, calculated strategy. Brother and sister, husband and wife, king and queen, one flesh, one throne. The names began to blur. Ptolemy followed Ptolemy. Cleopatra followed Cleopatra. Like echoes trapped in a tomb, their identities collapsed under repetition. But their marriages were not sacred. They were war. Because unlike the early pharaohs, the Ptolemies were surrounded by enemies, jealous nobles, whispering Romans, volatile generals, and the ever-fickle people. To keep the throne, they turned inward. Again. Marrying a sister meant no in-laws, no foreign alliances, no divided loyalties. Everything stayed locked behind palace walls. Everything could be managed, controlled. But what could not be controlled was human nature. Love cannot be ordered like a marriage. Desire cannot be commanded like a servant, and when the bonds of incest are forged not in reverence but in necessity, they break in strange, violent ways. Children were born confused about who their parents were. Assassinations became a family tradition. Jealousy wasn't between nations, it was between beds. And then came Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh, the one history remembers and rewrites. She was not the first Cleopatra. She wasn't even the second. But she was the only one who made the name matter. Not because she was beautiful, as Roman poets claimed. Not because she was seductive, as her enemies feared. But because she understood the cost of power and paid it willingly. She married her brother, Ptolemy the Sea, as custom demanded. He was a boy, a puppet, a name beside hers. When he tried to rule alone, she didn't argue. She raised an army. When he tried to exile her, she didn't beg. She sailed back with Julius Caesar. She knew the rituals were rotting, the incest a performance, the throne a theater of ghosts, but she played her part perfectly. Then she married another brother, Ptolemy X, and when he became inconvenient, he disappeared. The incest was no longer a sacred bond. It was a weapon, a symbol not of undivine order, but of a system that had collapsed into paranoia. Cleopatra's true power came not from who she married, but from who she chose not to marry. She gave herself to Caesar, to Antony, to Rome, not out of submission, but to protect Egypt from being consumed entirely, to trade the illusion of love for temporary sovereignty, to preserve a dying world for one more generation. But the spell broke. Rome came anyway. The throne crumbled. And the line ended. There would be no more pharaohs, no more divine marriages, no more sister queens. Cleopatra died with poison at her lips, and a lifetime of masks behind her eyes. She was the last of a line born from incest, but ruled by intelligence. The last ruler to understand that power without love becomes performance, and that performance without belief becomes a death sentence. Her son Caesarion, the child of a Roman god and an Egyptian goddess, was murdered. The last heir, the last spark. And with him, Egypt closed the chapter on 1,000 years of royal blood turned inward. The temples fell silent. The gods were still, the thrones were cold, and the people, those who had once sung to the sacred marriages of kings and queens, were left with ruins and foreign flags. The incest, once holy, had become history, a lesson buried under marble, a curse written in bone, but the scars remain, in tombs, in DNA, in the half-finished reliefs of unnamed rulers who clung to purity like a noose. Because when the gods demand perfection, the only thing left to sacrifice is everything human. Power isn't inherited, it's extracted, torn from the hands of others, carved into the bones of your children, and preserved through ritual until the ritual forgets why it began. By the time incest became normal in Egypt's dynasties, it had already stopped being sacred. It was habit, and habits rot. Pharaohs married their sisters not because they loved them, but because they feared everyone else more. Fear of foreign blood, fear of betrayal, fear that letting anyone in would loosen the grip on the throne. So the court became a prison. The family became a loop. The crown became a curse. Behind the gold and marble, the royal line was collapsing inward. Inbreeding was not just dangerous. It was disfiguring. Mutations emerged. Children were born weak, sick, brittle. Some died young. Others survived, but lived twisted lives behind palace walls, hidden from the public eye. Because how do you show divinity when your gods limp? The priests rewrote prophecies. Sculptors softened jawlines. Artists invented symmetry where none existed. But the blood told the truth. Akhenaten's elongated skull, Tutankhamun's clubbed foot and cleft palate, the missing bones, the rushed burials, the genetic markers repeating like echoes in a haunted room. This was the price of power, a lineage so pure it broke itself. And yet they continued, not because it worked, but because it was all they had left. Each pharaoh thought he could beat the curse by sheer will, by building taller obelisks, deeper tombs, grander temples, as if monuments could outrun blood. But history does not forget the body. What once was godhood became a gene pool of ghosts. By the final centuries of Egyptian rule, incest was no longer divine. It was desperate, and everyone knew it. The people still bowed. The priests still chanted. But the reverence had turned to performance, and the audience had grown tired. Behind closed doors, advisors whispered of reforms, of finding wives from noble families outside the bloodline, of marrying for strength, not tradition. But tradition held the knife. Any change meant admitting the weakness, that the gods were not gods, that the pharaoh was just a man in gold paint, married to a woman who looked like his mother, bearing children who could barely breathe. So the lie continued, for one more generation, and then another, until Cleopatra stood on the edge of collapse and chose something else. Rome. Love. Death. But by then it was too late. Egypt had already bled itself dry. The incestuous dynasty had become a hall of mirrors, each generation reflecting the last, growing dimmer, more fractured, more afraid. And at the center of it all stood the Pharaoh. Not as a god, not as a king, but as a man surrounded by reflections of himself, and none of them whole. He had everything, power, gold, temples, armies, but no future. Because when you marry your sister to stay in power, you don't just cut yourself off from the world, you cut off the world from itself. You build walls so thick that not even memory can pass through. You worship a family tree that curls into itself like a serpent eating its own tail. And in the end, you find that godhood is not immortal. It's just lonely. The last breath of Egypt did not come with a scream. It came with a whisper behind a stone wall, a hiss of poison, a closing of doors. Cleopatra lay in her chamber, wrapped in silence, surrounded by the ruins of 1,000 years of incest, power, war, and worship. She had married her brothers, buried them, birthed a son from the most powerful man in Rome, and watched the empire swallow them all. The empire she tried to tame with beauty, with wit, with lineage. But in the end, Egypt wasn't killed by Caesar, or Octavian, or Rome. It was undone by the very system meant to protect it. A system that married sister to brother until there were no strangers left to trust, no alliances to build, no blood left unpoisoned. It is easy to laugh at the idea of a pharaoh marrying his sister. Easy to call it primitive, barbaric, absurd. But what if it was just a mirror? A mirror of what happens when power becomes fear, when family becomes property, when tradition becomes a trap. The story of the pharaohs is not just ancient, it is eternal, because we still build dynasties, of blood, of business, of belief. We still keep things in the family. We still confuse control with love. And we still crown ourselves gods while ignoring what we've buried to get there. Somewhere in the Valley of the Kings lies a tomb that was never finished. The walls are blank. The inscription's missing. The sarcophagus empty. Archaeologists believe it was meant for a pharaoh whose name was erased from history, a ruler who ruled in silence, who tried to keep the line pure one last time, whose body was never found. No one knows why the tomb was abandoned. No one knows if he ever existed. But maybe that's the point. Because when your legacy is built on the illusion of purity, your end is silence, not conquest, not triumph, just dust. The same dust that once crowned kings and kissed sisters and buried gods. It covers us all, and beneath it, the truth waits. Not in hieroglyphs, not in monuments, but in the space between names, where love became law, and blood became burden, and the throne once divine became a tomb, not for one pharaoh, but for the idea of power itself,